I want to talk about how to draft a well-written thesis statement. You are going to be doing a fairly long paper, upwards around 20 pages, and so you need to have a very meaty thesis statement, something that really provides a roadmap for your argument that will be in your paper. So I grabbed a student example of a well-written thesis statement. It was part of a larger paper pertaining to the use of nonviolent protest techniques. So in red, and I will post this up on Blackboard for you, in red I make some comments. So the first paragraph here sets up the argument, identifying the two sides to the debate. Now note that the author includes a definition to clarify how he's going to use the concept. This is important. If you are using a definition, a concept that may have different perspectives, you might want to make sure that you clearly state in your thesis or at the very top of your argument the definition so everybody's on the same page. Now, the author also briefly notes the reason why people support the use of violence. So we have resorting to violence seems to be the ultimate option chosen by people in a conflict. At first, violence may appear attractive for resolving conflicts because of its historical use in conflicts and its short-term tangible effects, whereas nonviolent effects are more difficult to visualize. There is an assumption that violence is the most effective way to win the conflict. Political scientists believe that violence is a more coercive and thus more likely to achieve policy changes. As Pape describes, opposing groups have recourse to violence because it is believed to be the most efficient way to achieve their goals. However, over the years, there's been an increase in the number of people utilizing nonviolent techniques to bring about social and political changes. Chenoweth and Stephen define nonviolent resistance as a civilian-based method used to wage conflict through social, psychological, economic, and political means without the threat or use of violence that includes acts of omissions, acts of commission, or a combination of both. So here, the author has set up the topic of the paper. This is kind of the generalized, this is where this debate occurs, and in the first paragraph, the author has chosen to kind of mostly focus on the idea that, oh yeah, some people do think that violent protest actually accomplishes the goals. And they think it's efficient. So the author is giving you reasons why that side of the argument supports the claim that violence is the way to go. So then finishing with a definition, you can see that he really broadens the concept of nonviolent resistance, demonstrating that it's actually fairly complex. It has very, very different layers there that can be utilized. Maybe you don't need all of those techniques, but some of those are very, very helpful. I think that it sends the message is like, well, nonviolence technique is actually very thoughtful. It's not just simply not responding, but we've thought deeply about the many layers there are. So the next paragraph, after the author has set up what's going to be in the paper, the author's claim is placed at the bottom of this second paragraph, the second to the last sentence, and the roadmap starts at the top of the paragraph but leads you to the author's claim. The claim can be placed at the top and then the roadmap to follow. So the organization isn't as critical necessarily as you need a claim and you need a roadmap. And when I'm referring to roadmap, I mean that's the evidence or the direction that your argument's going to take. And it's pretty substantive and detailed. Your reader ought to be able to read the thesis statement and have a really good idea what is contained in that paper. The claim that the author is going to defend and the evidence or the reasoning in support of the claim. So the roadmap is the evidence the author will discuss in the paper to support the claim that nonviolent protest is the most successful technique to achieve political change. The roadmap also functions as an outline for your argument. Once you've outlined your argument, it's much easier to then write an organized argument, as you just need to refer to your thesis statement as you progress through the paper. This technique helps to keep your argument focused and helps to avoid running down rabbit paths unnecessarily. A thesis statement does take time to draft, and typically it requires multiple editing. But it's well worth the time and effort, as it will make the writing of the paper much faster because you have a plan. I mean, think about it. If you're running down rabbit paths and you have to engage in some really heavy editing later after you've written your paper, that's not a good use of your time. It's much better to figure out the shape that your argument is going to take and make sure that you have the evidence that will support what it is that you're trying to claim in your paper. And so keep that in mind. So here we can look at the argument. Nonviolence is not a new concept. Martin Luther King Jr. defends nonviolence by using different historical examples to show that civil disobedience has been part of our society for longer than violence and wars. In effect, he asserts that it is, to a degree, Socrates' civil disobedience that brought academic freedom in our society. He also uses the German case under Hitler to confirm that civil disobedience is sometimes necessary. What Hitler did during World War II was legal. However, people still decided not to abide by the law because it was an unjust law. Additionally, the last few decades have put light on the efficacy of nonviolence. In fact, these civilian movements have successfully used nonviolent methods, including boycotts, strikes, protests, and organized non-cooperation to challenge entrenched power and exact political concessions in different countries. Extensive literature demonstrates that nonviolence is an effective means to achieve social and political changes. The authors argue, for example, that in the modern era, nonviolence has played a prominent role in movements for civil liberties, environmental justice, social equity, and an end to warfare. The most known successful movements are Gandhi and his nonviolent resistance to British colonial rule in India, and Martin Luther King Jr. during the civil rights movement. So, the author sets up the argument, kind of lays out the ground on the issue of violent and nonviolent protests. Then the next paragraph provides the direction that the author's argument is going to take. If you look at the paper, the author deals with each of these. It's as a roadmap, like a sign on a road as you progress towards your goal. And so it's important to make sure that this is well crafted. You will probably have to do multiple editing and really work it over, but that time spent doing that will actually help the rest of the writing project to go much quicker, because that means you're organized, you have direction, you have organization. These are all qualities that we want to see in a well-written paper. I will post this on Blackboard so you can refer to it again.